Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Omni Viewer, and as you know by now, I am a Godzilla fan who owns and has seen every Godzilla movie ever made. That probably comes as a surprise to absolutely no one, but what is a surprise, to me at least, is that there's one Godzilla movie in particular that hardly anyone, not even the really hardcore fans, ever seem to talk about. That movie, of course, being the second film in the franchise, Godzilla Raids Again. Now, you would think that G-fans would be chomping at the bit to discuss this thing, given its stateside scarcity. Warner Brothers, the company that originally distributed the film back in the 50s, was at the time run by dimwits who inexplicably hated the very idea of sequels, which makes me wonder why they licensed it in the first place. So they had the writers concoct brand new dialogue for the dub and had the editors chop the thing to pieces to the point where it was barely recognizable as a Godzilla movie. This final product, christened Gigantus the Fire Monster, was the only version of the movie that existed in America for decades, and it just barely existed at that. Finding a VHS copy of Gigantus the Fire Monster was like finding the tomb of an Egyptian pharaoh completely untouched by grave robbers, and finding a copy of the original Godzilla Raids Again was like finding the Ark of the Covenant inside that same tomb. But then, Classic Media got their hands on the rights and released the DVD with both versions on the same disc. You would think the fandom would have been all over this one. Finally, a chance to see the lost classic in all its glory. Instead, fans bought it, watched it, and then went back to complaining about the TriStar remake. This is an error which must be corrected. Godzilla Raids Again deserves a lot more attention than it gets. And when looked at in the right context, it's actually a great companion to the original film. What do I mean by that? Well, we'll have to take a closer look. At the original cut, that is. It's 1955, 1 year after Godzilla's devastating attack on Tokyo. Shoichi Tsukioka and Koji Kobayashi are two best friends who work for a fishing company. They fly scout planes to locate schools of fish, a tricky task these days since the immediate waters around Tokyo Bay are an aquatic wasteland thanks to the oxygen destroyer. During such a trip, Koji is forced to ground his malfunctioning plane on an island, and Shoichi must land to rescue him. While there, they make a terrifying discovery. On the island is a second Godzilla, and it's locked in battle against another prehistoric titan, identified as Anguirus back on the mainland. As the two titans bring their battle in the direction of Osaka, the government must figure out a new plan for avoiding a disaster since they now have two kaiju to deal with, and the only weapon guaranteed to work is gone. When you watch Godzilla Raids Again, the first thing you'll notice is how different it is from the original movie. Whereas Godzilla King of the Monsters was a dour film, filled with scathing political jabs, frighteningly realistic depictions of nuclear holocaust, just with a dinosaur at the center of it, and a very dark ending, the sequel is surprisingly upbeat and optimistic. Heck, people actually laugh in this movie, which doesn't happen at all in the first film. Another striking difference you'll notice is the characters who compose the human cast. King of the Monsters featured a roster that was typical for monster movies of the 50s. Our heroes were scientists, political figures, soldiers, reporters, and a girl. By contrast, Godzilla Raids Again focuses on relatively normal working-class Joes, or Jiros as the case may be. These guys are not combatants or geniuses, but rather average men and women trying to make an honest yen. The final significant thing to keep in mind is perhaps the movie's greatest contribution to the whole genre, the kaiju fight. This new Godzilla is not simply showing up to wreak havoc on his own, but is fighting a new monster, the spiky Anguirus. However, the big mystery is why they are fighting. The only explanation we are given is that the two races are old enemies who just naturally oppose each other. Their fight doesn't even start in Japan, and yet still winds up affecting it all the same. So those are all the major differences between the first film and the second film, but how do they make Godzilla Raids Again worth discussing? Well, each of those elements is a thematic continuation of what we saw in Godzilla King of the Monsters, and I must stress the word continuation in that statement. In 1955, the Cold War was still young, but very active. The Korean War had just ended, communist witch hunts were sweeping the United States, and the Soviet Union was encroaching wherever it could. As you know, the capitalist United States and communist Soviet Russia were diametrically opposed to each other, and their empires bordered the two largest oceans in the world. At the time, Japan couldn't really pretend like the conflict had nothing to do with them. They were a hop, skip, and a jump away from the major communist nations, and America had a plethora of military bases on and around their little islands. These were nations armed to the teeth with weapons of war and enough nukes to destroy the world several times over. And what did Japan have, you ask? Well, after World War II, their military was dissolved, so they had diddly squat. So from their perspective, two titans were fighting for supremacy, and their poor defenseless little island was caught in the middle of it. Should that battle between those titans ever come to their shores, they would be in for a real disaster. On film, this is represented by Godzilla and Anguirus fighting for dominance, a conflict which comes to Japan and lays waste to Osaka. Godzilla and Anguirus representing the battle between America and Russia may seem unusual at first, but the allegory isn't that much of a stretch. Godzilla's origins are canonically the result of American nuclear tests, so the connection there is obvious. And Anguirus, well, I have no way of proving he's a direct metaphor for Mother Russia. The YA novels written in the late 90s by Mark Saraceni rewrote his origins as a Russian sea monster by coincidence. I suppose the spikes might be the spires of the Kremlin? Screw it. Just accept the metaphor so I can make my point. So, capitalism and communism are duking it out on Japan's doorstep. Who does this affect the most? It affects the people. Contrary to the popular stereotype, not everyone in Japan is a ninja or a scientist. Most of them are just average schlubs like you or me, and they're trying to make a living in the world. During this particular point in history, their livelihoods were being threatened. Remember how I said that Tsukioka and Kobayashi work for a fishing company? Well, back in the 50s, the Japanese fishing industry was in deep water, so to speak, thanks to their primary source of fish being irradiated on a regular basis by nuclear tests. The people in charge were no help, so the common men and women had to solve problems on their own. All of these ingredients sound like they should make a very dark, very bleak movie, even more so than the original. And yet Godzilla Raids Again is a far lighter film than its predecessor. Even when characters die, the survivors find reasons to keep going. Why is that? In my mind, the positive mindset in Godzilla Raids Again is meant to express Japan finally moving beyond the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Feeling sadness and anger towards a tragedy is a perfectly natural part of the grieving process. But by God, it's no way to live. The atomic bomb was one of the worst things to happen to Japan, no argument there. But Japan still exists. So long as there is life, there is still hope for a better tomorrow, even if it seems like the world is going stark raving mad around you. Aim for the future, and things will get better. Heck, with recent natural disasters having literally reshaped the Japanese coastline, this is a message the nation needs again. That, I believe, is the ultimate message of Godzilla Raids Again. This movie let the people of Japan know that they could move beyond the bombings and the loss of the war. And really, if they were to survive as a nation, they had to. It really brings up the question of why more people don't discuss this movie. But hopefully I've done my part to change that. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer, signing off. Although, if I'm being perfectly honest, seeing the kaiju moving around that quickly during the fights, it's kinda weird looking.